Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I guess it's 5 o'clock is evening, so we're there, and welcome to the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty next perspective talk on economic liberty, of course. The Perspectives lecture series emerges from the mission of the center, which is to evaluate the contribution of economic liberty to human betterment. One of the ways to pursue that mission is to invite a variety of guests who interrogate aspects of economic liberty, evaluate its role in human betterment, revisit important debates. I guess we're partly tonight doing that, and also considering its relation to other values and freedoms that we may possess. Brian Domitrovic is a historian, professor, and senior associate at the Laffer Center for Supply-Side Economics. He completed a PhD in history, working with the well-known economic historian David Landis. I'm envious, and he's a great scholar. After serving as a visiting scholar of conservative thought and policy at the University of Colorado Boulder, Brian served as the department chair at Sam Houston State University for several years before joining the Laffer Center for Supply-Side Economics. In 2009, he published the book Iconoclasts, which is a standard history of supply-side economics and economists who are supply-siders, which was followed by several books detailing aspects of the Reagan-era acceptance of Laffer's argument. He most recently co-authored with Arthur Laffer the book Taxes Have Consequences, which is a historical study of income taxes in the United States. There are several copies of this book out in the foyer for those who might be interested in purchasing it. There was a price, I've forgotten it. So, small price. $20, there we go. Please welcome Brian to ASU, and there'll be ample time for questions after his talk.
Thank you, Melissa. Thank you to the Center for the Study of Economic Liberty. It's great to be here. I'm very happy to offer the book for cash for $15 if somebody has exact change. Otherwise, it's $20, so it's exact change. Let me tell you a little bit about myself and what we're going to do tonight. I'm a historian of supply-side economics, and I work closely with Arthur Laffer every day. Just talked to him a second ago, and he wishes all of you well. He was just out here for the Mets and Money Conference last week in Scottsdale. And he and I and Gene Sinkfield, who was one of the founders of Dimensional Fund Advisors, the 8th largest money management firm in the country, Gene is also an author, a co-author of Taxes Have Consequences. So it's Arthur Laffer, me, and Gene Sinkfield. And we brought Jeannie in for an important reason. She's a very rich lady, and she has deep experience in dealing with income taxes from the perspective of somebody who doesn't need the income. And that ends up being very decisive in the history of the income tax. When people who don't need the income really care about the income tax, amazing things, usually that are not good, happen to the economy. Because if the rich don't deploy their capital naturally, nasty things happen. So we think that Jeannie's contribution and her expertise in the practical matter of having money and dealing with the tax code was essential. And she's the one who, in fact, who came up with the title of the book, Taxes Have Consequences. I'd like to do three things to introduce the talk a little bit with these three graphs, then I'll turn that off. Then I want to have a kind of a little bit of a profound talk, if you don't mind, just for about 15 minutes. Talk I've given a little bit before to Hillsdale College, but I want to kind of get out there more about the very deep kind of spiritual history of the income tax, if we might think it that way. Why a nation such as the United States would opt for an income tax as it did in 1913. What was the zeitgeist, the cultural mood that brought it. And then and that's a bit sinister, I must say, some of that. And then after that, we'll just talk about tax shelters, because the book a history of the income tax in the United States. We've had an income tax since 1913, 111 years, is in very large part a history of tax sheltering. It's impossible to write a history of the income tax without simultaneously writing a history of tax sheltering, legal tax sheltering, legal tax avoidance. So just to dispatch with these graphs, how we came to write this book initially is that we were caught up in paying attention to all this Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez income inequality literature. You may be familiar with Thomas Piketty's book. It sold 2 million copies. Maybe you are familiar. Capital in the 21st Century. And he has this famous U-shaped curve. This is essentially it. This is the top 1% of income earners in the United States and their share of total income in the United States. In fact, before the income tax, or the very early years of the income tax, the top 1% share of income in the United States was very high, around 25%. And then it plunged for 50 years low to, 10%? And then went up again in the 80s to 25%. Okay, so that was the graph that got us thinking, hey, we want to write this history of the income tax because we looked at Piketty-Saez and where they said they got their data, and they said we got it from income tax returns, the statistics of income. We looked at all the income tax returns in the United States history, and we looked at reported income, and they make a big deal about that. We look at pre-tax reported income, what the top 1% reported to the IRS. And we're like, interesting. Because when taxes were low or non-existent, they reported a lot of income. And when taxes were high, 91% in the 1950s, for 50 years, 1932 to 1981, the top rate of the income tax was over 63%. Okay, when tax rates are high, what's the top 1% do? Does not report a lot of income. Then when Reagan came in, the cut tax rates were lower, the top 1% reported a lot of income. And we're like, where's the unreported income? Because you can legally tax avoid. Tax avoidance is a perfectly legal activity. So Piketty-Saez just studied reported income. Well, they proved our point. As soon as you raise taxes on the rich, they shelter their income. So we said, we'll write a history of that. So this is the graph that got us going on why we wrote this book. This is another graph that I think, this is from Thomas Piketty. I think this revolutionizes study of the Great Depression, personally. This is from Thomas Piketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century, the big left-wing Marxist economist. You'll notice this is 4 countries, the United States, France, United Kingdom, Germany, the big guys. I mean, the 4 biggest economies in the world, plus Japan, as of, say, 1910. And very much the case today. 0% for all intents and purposes. There were no income taxes in the world to speak of coming into the 20th century. They didn't exist. They're negligible. And then, World War I, and then people calm down and income taxes once the 20s start, their income taxes. And then look where they go. So we just looked at that graph and we just said, well, now we know why the Great Depression happened. The Industrial Revolution, David Landis, who I studied with, he's a great historian of the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution occurred, the great increase in mass prosperity, the bringing to the world of things like the mass middle class, mass employment. That occurred under the auspices globally of zero income taxes. The Great Depression happened very quickly after the permanent imposition of income taxes globally, because those who deploy capital all of a sudden had to deal with this, and there was just a massive pulling back of capital. So we think this graph, we happen to believe, we have a couple chapters on this, we think that the Great Depression has been badly misunderstood, particularly in the discipline of economics, and it's looking for monetary causes and that sort of thing. We think that there's a whole new world of understanding the Great Depression as a consequence of taxes. We expect that further studying the 21st century, the Great Depression should really focus on the immense, brand new, immense, biggest country tax impositions right before the Great Depression. One more. We ran the numbers from Piketty-Saez's own data. We looked at the average reported income of the top 1% against the average marginal tax rate subtracted from 100. So if you take the marginal tax rate today, it's 37%. Subtract it from 100, that's 63%. So if you're a top earner and you're subject to the top tax rate, you keep 63 cents on your dollar. That's what we call the return rate. And so our return rate or retention rate is the red dotted line. And when the return rate was high, the rich reported all sorts of income. The blue is their average reported income of the top 1%. And when the return rate was low, that means the tax rate's very high, rich didn't report anything. If you want rich to report the rich to report income, lower the tax rate. Needless to say, Arthur Laffer is very famous for his tax rate, tax revenue curve. This is the empirical basis of the Laffer curve. The rich report all sorts of income when their return rate goes up, and that means that their tax rate goes down. And these are all IRS statistics. In fact, they're the very statistics that Piketty Sayers took from the IRS. Okay, so those first two graphs got us going, and then this is the beginning of our statistical work. And what I'm going to do now is just close that. We can talk about them. So I just want to spend about 15 minutes talking about some kind of deep zeitgeist history of the income tax. And what I want to do is connect it to, I think we have the income tax because of the Civil War, because of the national memory of the Civil War, and the desire of this country to kind of knit itself, bind up its wounds, bind up the nation's wounds, as Lincoln said. And it's also the reason, the income tax is also the reason that there was World War I and World War II. So I just want to talk about those kind of deep thoughts for about 15 minutes as the background to this, and then we'll get into some of the fun of tax sheltering. There are two halves to American political economic history. The first is 1718 to 1913, from the Constitution to the founding of the two modern macroeconomic institutions, the income tax and the Federal Reserve. The second is 1913 to the present, income tax and Federal Reserve, both in 1913. In length of time, these two halves are about the same. The first span to 1913 was 124 years. The second is 111 years and counting. We can speak of the two halves of American political economic history as such because each has distinguishing characteristics setting them apart. In the first half, growth was higher, about 4% per year. Government spending was lower at an average of maybe 6% of national output or GDP per year. And the federal revenue system relied in the great part on foreign sources via the tariff. In the second half, growth was lower at about 3% per year. Government spending regularly totaled from 20 to over 30% of GDP, up from 6. And the federal revenue system largely relied on domestic, not foreign, taxation of income, in fact. I would like to contend, just to begin this evening, that the income tax was the more decisive of the institutions of 1913, more important and consequential than the Federal Reserve. In particular, I would like to outline and discuss certain important cultural historical forces that coincided with and to a degree impelled and shaped the income tax with respect to primarily its rise in 1913 and secondarily its entrenchment in American political economy since then. I would like to discuss how the income tax reflected certain predilections of the American people, beginning with those of the victorious North in the afterglow of the Civil War. In the German tradition, this sort of historical exploration would be called Geistesgeschichte, or how broadly held, largely unstated social ideas reveal themselves in actual historical developments. 1913, that's the year the income tax was started via constitutional amendment. That wasn't the big news in the country. 1913 was the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. The largest gathering of Civil War veterans, North and South, happened on the old Pennsylvania battlefield that July. In recent years before that, monuments to Confederate heroes had sprung up throughout the South, with little exception taken from Northern observers. In Congress in 1913, the tariff, the second issue after slavery that had ignited Southern passion against the North in the antebellum era, was under severe downward revision in exchange for a tax on high incomes recently made constitutional by the 16th Amendment that had been ratified that February. The first income tax, which passed by statute in October 1913, came in the law known as the Underwood Tariff. Tariff duties went down by about a third in exchange for a 1 to 7% progressive tax on high incomes. Incomes beginning at $3,000 in current dollars, perhaps $90,000 today. To get even hit with the 2% rate in the first income tax, an income earner had to make $23,000, or about $700,000 today. The first income tax was a low progressive tax exclusively on high earners. The great majority of such people in 1913 were from the North. In 1916, federal statistics revealed that of all income taxes paid, less than 5% was coming from the 11 former states of the Confederacy. 65% of income taxes paid was coming from 5 major states of the Union side of the war: New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Illinois, and Ohio, stalwarts of the Union. The inhabitants of the biggest of these, New York, were themselves paying 35% of all income taxes coming to the government. It was a remarkable switch. Ever since the demise of the era of good feelings in the 1820s, the issue that had tormented national political culture, aside from slavery and race, was the tariff. Southerners caterwauled that as a consumption tax, the tariff fell more greatly on the less moneyed region of the country, namely their own. Since the North, with its riches, had a smaller propensity to consume, it got hit with the tariff less. Had there been an income tax prior to the 16th Amendment, it would have been assessed, per the Constitution, to states by virtue of their share of the national population, not their share of national income. That's the way the Constitution of 1789 had it. In the antebellum South, as historian Robin Einhorn has explained so well, this would have meant whites footing the bill for 3 of every 5 of the slave population, because the slaves would have to pay the taxes too, because he was counted by population. That's what the origin of the 3/5 clause. So South Carolina, for example, which was over 50% enslaved in the antebellum period, that really small sub 1% of the population would have to carry the load for the whole state's taxation. Like, well, let's not have an income tax. New York, the slavery went way down, and so it would fall on actual income earners who actually had monetary means to pay. The move away from a tariff in 1913 in favor of an income tax borne by the richest in the North, having nothing to do with population but just by income, by the very personification of the Yankee, was a remarkable act of binding up the nation's wounds, to call on Lincoln's words of the second inaugural address. It is probably accurate to call the 16th Amendment another of the Civil War amendments. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments addressed ending slavery, establishing due process, and the universal male franchise, all eventual Union objectives explicitly during the Civil War. The goal of the peace, as Lincoln was able to outline it before he died in the spring of 1865, was to have, quote, his famous words, malice towards none, charity for all. The income tax was consistent with the mandate of Northern and Southern reconciliation that had reached its apex in the memorialization of the valor of the Civil War that the 50th anniversary of 1913 had brought forth. The rich Yanks would pick up the nation's tax bill almost in whole after 1913. What a gesture to the South. It is therefore probably important to comprehend the income tax as a development in American political culture in the longue durée of the sectional conflict from the 1820s to the 1900s. The last act in putting that conflict behind the nation was the North's picking up the nation's tax bill in whole via a non-apportioned income tax on high earners. Andrew Mellon was clear on this in the 1820s. He had said that federal taxation could be removed as a political issue if it only involved low rates on the rich. They would pay without complaint or evasion. There would be heaps of revenue, and that would be that. Mellon actually said that we could actually eliminate taxation as a political issue. If you just have a 10% tax on the rich, they'll pay. They won't avoid it. They won't complain. It's very interesting the nation didn't take his advice. That probably means Congress wanted to keep taxation alive as a political issue. It also means Mellon was naive. You can't eliminate taxation as a political issue. Did I call Andrew Mellon naive? Yeah, that'll come back to haunt me. Yeah. In his second inaugural address, Lincoln said to close that in the forthcoming period of binding up the nation's wounds, he wished that the American people might, quote, do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. The income tax surely contravened any such process in 3 ways, however, one absolutely clear and 2 subtextual. The tariff was an external tax in the jargon of the day. It was paid by foreigners in the customs house when traders were about to disembark at port. The tax was not paid at point of sale to Americans. It was paid by foreign agents before any sale was made. Sometimes you had a grace period of 60 days. It required that foreigners voluntarily take to coming to the United States, usually a serious journey across the sea, with goods for sale and ready to pay tariff duties before any sale was made. The income tax, in contrast, was an internal tax, a tax levied upon those the government had already captured, as in the term habeas corpus. The United States had the domestic population already. It doesn't have foreign populations unless they volunteer to come over. It already has the domestic population, and now it chose to tax that portion. The impetus to foreign warfare was serious. Under a tariff, foreign warfare had better be short and sweet, otherwise a government cannot fund itself, as the United States had discovered in 1812 and 1846. I mean, you're relying on foreigners for your tax revenue, and then you're going to war. It doesn't make any sense. No tariff. It was appropriate that during the Civil War, the United States put on an income tax, apportioned income tax, and put out greenbacks in debt. The jacked-up tariff of 1861 was useless. The United States paid for the Civil War via tariff revenue in the long global peace after 1865. They paid back the debt. Under an internal or domestic tax, a nation equips itself to fight for the long term. Since the engine of government revenue under an income tax is not foreign, by means of that engine, the nation can take an extended fight to the foreigners. The United States, moreover, set up the income tax in 1913 for generous, even idealistic reasons. It was part of binding up the nation's wounds in a final recognition that the American people had late been, quoting Lincoln again, engaged in a great civil war, testing whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated to long endure, as Lincoln at Gettysburg. If the United States had set up an income tax for prosaic reasons, perhaps great moral quests would not have come to it. But the United States did set up the income tax for great generous reasons. And great generous reasons, let alone a civil war that had left 660,000 dead, are supposed to have great meaning and set up great outcomes and great futures. If the United States was the last best hope of Earth, Lincoln again, the income tax had to serve as the domestic engine of doing what America had to do abroad. The American people today are still comfortable with the concept that the incredible warfare that racked the world from 1914 to 1945, starting the year after the federal income tax, in which the United States twice played the decisive role of resolution, ended because the United States stepped in and via military might reestablished a semblance of sanity and normality in the global order. I should therefore propose that the United States in some significant sense began World War I and World War II. If the global hegemons perceived that the United States would save their bacon, which it did, this lowered the cost of going to war. If these nations felt that they needed the experience of war, they could, owing to American proclivities, both have that experience and get away with it. It is imperative to note that by 1965, Japan and West Germany were the second and third richest countries in the world in an era of unprecedented mass prosperity. By this, I am suggesting that had the United States not unsettled itself to bind up its own sectional wounds in 1913 with a Yankee income tax, the casus belli in both cases, both wars, would have lost important foundational parts. First, there would have been no domestic engine of taxation within the United States. How could it launch huge, large foreign war military expeditions? Second, there would have been no sense of the need to do something grand. If the United States was instead not going to put closure on the Civil War, as Lincoln urged, if the North was going to continue to press its narrow advantage on the tariff and alcohol taxes and so on, the South hated alcohol taxes too. I mean, the NASCAR began as a run-rumming in North Carolina. The federal government's going to get rid of all that with prohibition. We're just going to tax our rich Yankees in New York, Southerners. See, we're being nice to you. We're binding up our nation's wounds. Yeah. Where would the idealism about the last best hope of Earth found a home? I mean, when you bind up the nation's wounds, now you can act on your idealism. The United States would have recognized itself as an ethically typical power if it had not had an income tax. We're just exploiting our own people, the South. Such places do not go on crusades to make the world safe for democracy or fight, as in World War II, to make the world free. They don't have the confidence to. In this way of seeing things, one of the reasons the foreign belligerents went to war in 1914, the 1930s and 1940s, drawing the United States in as a resolving agent in each case, was the sense those belligerents had that the United States wanted and was keen to step in to make the world safe and prosperous again. You could have it all. You could have the thrill of battle and the manliness and freshness of camp life, those things increasingly deprived a bourgeois society by 1914, if, along with millions of deaths and associated horror, knowing that in the end there will be the likes of economic miracles and decades of glorious prosperity after. The United States would clean everything up and be happy to. You could have it all. A sterner tradition of diplomacy, that of concern over entangling alliances in the Monroe Doctrine, perhaps, counseled guarding against one's own moral ambitions, one's own. Moral ambitions can bring nasty outcomes. Moral outcomes have an uncanny ability to trump their means. If the United States, in binding up the nation's wounds, outfitted itself with the income tax, in the income tax with the domestic engine, care of the rich, to raise money for itself, and explicitly thought its great sacrifices of the Civil War had been in the service of the last best hope of earth, how could it not involve itself in great foreign quests after 1913 with the money? It was perhaps so obvious that foreigners said, let's start the problems on the understanding that the United States will finish them, and in a way that will be consistent with our long-term ability to practice the life of consumerism and creature comforts. Europe and Japan after 1945. Moral hazard is a standard analytical concept in the financial markets. If it is clear that institutions will bail out bad bets and bad actors, on will come the bad bets and bad actors. Applying the concept in this example of geostrategic history, the domestic American income tax as an act of final resolution of the Civil War was the cue to foreigners to get the world wars going. Okay, that's weird Geistesgeschichte stuff, but I did want to give you some kind of deep weirdo background to the income tax, because there's no good reason that the income tax ever came about. I mean, you can sit here and talk about rich people and industrialists and all this stuff, and I think we can do this in Q&A. If you like. I think you can wash out all the good reasons for even having an income tax whatsoever. I mean, I'm still mystified that the United States, which runs the world monetary system, you can print dollars and just get global people just to give you goods and services for them. Why do we have a tax system at all? I mean, if you dominate the monetary system, there's no reason to have a tax. So it's just that deep background that's not in this book, but it's some ideas that I've been trying to articulate about why we even have an income tax to begin with. All right, I'd like to walk through some episodes of when the United States had the income tax beginning in 1913, and I'd like to dwell on a couple themes, certainly the Great Depression and the 1950s. 1950s are kind of a strangely understudied era in American history when the top rate of the income tax was 91%. It would be very interesting to see how the 1950s went along. And I'd also like to talk about the rise of the Rust Belt. So I think the income tax is at the absolute center of the two great malignant developments in modern 20th century American economic history. Number one, the Great Depression. Number two, the rise of the Rust Belt. Okay, so to begin with, the United States started its income tax in 1913 first by constitutional amendment. So the amendment had to be ratified so that the states didn't have to count their population. You could just tax people on the basis of how much money they were making. And it came in 1913, very small, so 1%, maybe 7% if you were making $2 million. And then World War I hit a couple months later, and the United States was neutral and staying out of it, but then it realized it was going to become a belligerent in 1917. And so the top rate of the income tax went all the way up. It went up 11-fold. It went to 77% in 1918 in 5 years. So, I mean, Larry Kudlow, who I wrote a book with on the John F. Kennedy tax cut of 1964, whenever I'm on his show on television or the radio, he always says, well, Brian, how much, he's waiting for a particular tagline that I have, how much did they raise the income tax, Brian, from 1913 when it started to 1918? And I said, Larry, it's just like the Bible says, 70 times, 7 times. I mean, they raised it from 7 to 77%. Isn't that in the Bible or something like that? Yeah, it sounds like 70 times, 7 times. So it's just an unbelievable increase in the marginal rate of the income tax. And when people talk about profiteering in the Civil War, DuPont, you look at DuPont's annual reports, and they're making explosives, they're reporting all sorts of income. Yeah, they had to pay their executives their tax at 77%. So, J.P. Morgan, and this is not to mention the inflation of the time, which have the value of all assets. So, they're raking in all these profits, and their net worths are collapsing. So, not a good time for rich people. Somehow, after 1918, the war ends. For the next 3 years, 1919 to 1921, the United States had a top rate of the income tax of 73%. Now, there had been no tradition. I emphasize that from that Piketty graph. Piketty said, we need these big income taxes. There was no tradition of income taxation anywhere in the world before 1913. You see what this, nil was the value before 1913. Boom, the United States leads the way. Emanuel Say has always said, the United States led the way. It did. Because, when you're Germany or England or Imperial Russia, mind you, or France, you don't have your government doesn't have any credibility with your own people. The Tsar is going to impose a 77% income tax on his subjects in 1916. No, he's not. He'll be overthrown. Poincaré in France? No, he's not. He's going to experience a military coup. if he does that. Same thing. Only the United States had the kind of domestic stability and coherence in the cauldron of World War I, which the United States was barely involved with comparatively, that it could even raise its income tax. It would be, in the Weberian sense, politically illegitimate for those other countries to do that. So they didn't. They kept these income tax. They started them and they kept them real low. Then as the war ended, then they jacked it up. And of course, the governments had tremendous legitimacy crises. I mean, every government, no government had the strength of the approbation of the people in the 20s in Europe. And lo and behold, they're raising their income taxes from nil to up to 50%. And that's when I'm saying you see the global investors start to say, wait a minute, you mean this income tax wasn't just a wartime measure? We're keeping it in peacetime? Oh, we have to reconsider our investment commitments. That's what causes the Great Depression. We hear about the gold standard, we hear about monetary policy, we hear about the Fed. This is just, an elephant. Nil to 50%. Oh, I used to keep all the money, now I keep half of it. I'm reconsidering investment commitments is the equivalent to 25% unemployment. Somehow the rates were not cut in the United States initially. 1919, 1921, they stayed at 73%. Now, then the new Treasury Secretary came in, Andrew Mellon, about the richest man in the country. He's the Pittsburgh zillionaire who made tons of money in all sorts of activities with his father's Mellon Bank. His father was a very, very modest banker, basically went bust in 1873. We have my personal favorite, my personal choice for best business book ever written in American history is Andrew Mellon's father's autobiography, the autobiography of Thomas Mellon, written in the 1880s. It's just simply a fantastic window into 19th century life and business. He was asking Irish widows not to take money out of his bank in 1873 because he didn't have it. And if you wouldn't, if you could please tell your friends not to take money. So his father was not particularly successful. He made his money initially building houses, and that would end up being very important for his tax policy. And then he did all sorts of things like founding Alcoa Aluminum Company America and Gulf Oil. It was worth probably about $1 billion. When the tax return there in the early 40s, something like 4 out of the 5 top tax returns usually every year were from Mellon family members. Andrew Mellon knew, how to make money and what the rich did with their money. He just said, you have to cut these tax rates. And he became Treasury Secretary in 1921 under Warren Harding and stayed there through the Coolidge administration and part of the Hoover administration. And he led a serial reduction in the top tax rate from 73% down to 25% by 1925. So it went from 73 down to 25, and then 25% is still a quarter of income at the top, and it would have been nil, it would have been zero in 1912. So the rich people are still like, And every year from 1920 to 1930, 11 straight years, every single year, the United States ran a budget surplus. Now, they had their huge World War I debt, which dwarfed the Civil War debt. I forget how much in real terms, but easily the largest debt in American history as of 1918. Easily the largest debt in American history. 11 straight years under a regime of tax rate cuts at the top. 11 straight years of surpluses. So Mellon's conclusion, I think our conclusion should be, the rich people of the United States assumed the income tax was going to continue to be cut. If you cut income tax rates when you have your huge debt and you run 11 straight years of surpluses, what's the next logical thing to do? Keep cutting the tax rate. It's all working. And if you don't do that, if you pause in that or have a second guessing about that, what are the rich people of the country going to pull back? And that's exactly what happened in 1930. So Andrew Mellon said, as he was urging Congress, and the opposition was crazy. It's very strange to see. I can't account for it. There was incredible opposition to Mellon's tax rate cuts at the top in the 20s. And the country had no tradition of an income tax. So where's this opposition? What is this opposition based on? It has no historical resources to draw from because there's no tradition of opposing those who want to cut income taxes in the United States because there was no income tax before 1912. Who are these Wright-Patmans and all these other slings and arrows coming with Andrew Mellon? I don't know. But he had a whale of a time getting these things through. But he did it. Okay, so there's a boom in the 20s. As rich people are like, oh, you're cutting taxes permanently. Okay, yeah, and Mellon suggested, more than suggested, he said they should go to 10%, a tithe. And he said tithe, religion has shown, great civilizations have shown over the many years, that people who are really invested in their community, like in a religion, will pay 10% of their income. They'll just volunteer it. Uncomplainingly, they won't hide their income. Number one, you have to have them really invested in the civilization. I think we're patriotic here in America. Everyone's like happy about America. Okay, the rich people will pay 10%. It goes to 11, they'll start avoiding it. It's at 25. And that's after his big-time tax cuts. Got to get it down. If you don't get it down, you're going to have a rich person's revolt. Boy, did we get one in the 30s. So Calvin Coolidge, Mellon, had a great relationship with him, exited office. 1929, Herbert Hoover was president, and Herbert Hoover didn't get along very well with Andrew Mellon. First hint after the stock market crash of October 29 was that Herbert Hoover issued an ex post facto tax cut. The top rate of the income tax went down in December 1929 from 25 to 24%. That was the first kind of income tax rebate. All taxes, by the way, back then were due the following March 15th. So it's not like today where you have to pay all year long and then prove that you paid on April 15th of the next year. You had to pay the entire previous year's income tax and file your return on March 15th of the following year. So they looked at the numbers in December 1929, and we're going to get too much money, so we'll just take 1% off everyone's income taxes. So that was an ex post facto tax cut, and those are the worst kinds of tax cuts because that means the activity's already happened. It has no incentive effect. If you say I'm going to cut the tax rate next year, oh, well, then I'll invest next year. I'm going to cut the tax rate last year. Well, I'm not going to check. I can't, wind back the clock and change. So it's actually, we've come to learn that's the worst kind. It's the first thing Herbert Hoover did. And then he forced Mellon out. He signed the tariff, increase in the tariff. What's this increase in the tariff? Huge. The United States adopted the Smoot-Hawley tariff in June 1930, biggest tariff in American history. Again, everything you just heard me saying about the Civil War, we're going to bind up the nation's wound. I mean, that just went down the drain. when Congress and Hoover conspired to pass the biggest tariff in America. It was bigger than the tariff of abominations eventually of the 1820s, 1830s, which is kind of weird. And then Herbert Hoover, after he scuttled Mellon off to become the ambassador to the court of St. James in England and replaced him, he raised the top rate of the income tax on January 1st, 1932 from 25 to 63%. Now, if a visitor from Mars is going to start saying, this is why you had the Great Depression. Now, I know. You look in the economics literature, and I think the economics literature is really getting long in the tooth on this, and it's very proud of itself about how good it is. Oh, man, have we proven how the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression. Ben Bernanke says, we have proven, thank you, Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, for telling us how the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression. How do you deal with that Piketty graph? You're not dealing with it at all. And the Federal Reserve is a chump compared to the income tax. The Federal Reserve is just like, moving money around, debits, credits. It's just a warehouse. It's a clearinghouse. Income tax, that's an imposition on rich people, on the actual deployers of capital. I mean, the top 1%, one of the reasons we focus on the top 1% essentially creates all jobs in this economy. I mean, they create all private jobs because they're the people who own the businesses, and they create all government jobs because they pay all the taxes. So the top 1% are responsible for all employment. You want to keep your top 1% very healthy if you want to have any jobs at all. A progressive income tax maxing out at 63%, that's not taking care of the top 1%. It's totally consistent with an unemployment crisis. So my argument, Arthur Laffer's argument, he knew Milton Friedman very well. And when they were faculty members at the University of Chicago together in the 60s and 70s, Milton Friedman's star argument was the Federal Reserve caused the Great Depression, and Arthur Laffer's like, it's taxes. Zero taxes on rich people on anyone, including rich people, before in 1912. Only 25% in 1928? Oh, you're courting a Great Depression. We're still in the middle of the Roaring Twenties. You have 25% income tax on rich? I'm going to expect at least 25% less investment. And more than that, because the 25% implies that we can play with that rate. And the play you do. 4 years later, it's 63. Okay, what did the rich people do during the Great Depression? That's where the fun starts. Yeah, we see that reported income of the rich plunge in the Great Depression, and tax rates go up for 25%. Now, under 25%, tax avoidance was crazy. And Mellon said the rate goes to 11. You'll go, people go nuts. So, our favorite example, and this is a legendary example in the tax code. In fact, virtually all tax planners And the entire tax bar and tax jurisprudence refers to this law, this rule, perennially. And that's the George M. Cohan rule. You know, George M. Cohan, the great Broadway maestro, Yankee Doodle Dandy and all those songs. Give my regards to Broadway. Remember being to Herald Square, all those great songs that George M. Cohan wrote. So he through Broadway reviews, right? He was a Broadway producer. And he had all these expenses. He would take the whole cast and all the critics out to dinner every night, like Delmonico's, like everybody. You know, all the showgirls with their radio, their Rockettes, you know. He'd take everyone, 200 people, take them out to dinner. And all the critics, he was making sure the critics do. And they dined with the showgirls and Broadway babies, say goodnight, the milkman's on his way. They went till 6 a.m. The sun's up. And who picks up the bill? George M. Cohan picks up the bill. And he does this, routinely. And then he submits the receipts to the IRS and just subtracts all that from his income. No, I don't know. Yeah, okay, I made $5 million last year, minus the $3 million, and the numbers are actually in the hundreds of thousands in the 20s, minus the $3 million that I, paid for the Broadway babies saying goodnight in the party. And the IRS, the Revenue Bureau at that point just took one look at that. Oh, it's ridiculous. You owe money. This is all your income. What do you mean? These are business expenses. I'm in Broadway business. I'm a Broadway producer. You know what Broadway producers do? They take showgirls out all night long with all the critics. That's how you do business in Broadway. You want to produce a show successfully, get good reviews, keep your workers happy. And the courts sided with him every single time. I forget if it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It certainly went to Learned Hand at the top appellate court. And Learned Hand, the great jurist, he's just, he was not nice to the Revenue Bureau. And these lines from Learned Hand are still standards in tax jurisprudence to this day. No man has any obligation to arrange his affairs so that he pays the most taxes. And he says, and furthermore, and this became what was known as the George M. Cohan rule, is that it is the nature of the business that determines how much they can deduct. So if your business is one in which you're likely to have blowout parties, if crazy expenses are part of your culture, then you get to deduct crazy expenses. The culture of the business determines the extent of the deductibility. If you're some kind of skinflint business, we don't spend money on anything, okay, then I guess you don't get to, that's the culture of your business means that the IRS can't, you can't claim a lot of expenditures. But if the culture of your business is you have a lot of expenses that are crazy, then the IRS must accept those as deductions. George M. Cohan crushed it in the court system throughout the 20s. And the federal government kept suing him, and he kept winning. And today, the George M. Cohan rule is the biggest brick keystone in tax jurisprudence as there is. Wait to see what happens in the 1950s with the Cohan rule. So then rich people just go crazy with this stuff in the 30s. Okay, one or two examples. Hobby farms, man. So they raised the tax rate up to 63% in 1932. And all right, so rich people start, setting up these personal holding companies. So what they would do is they'd set up like Jules Bache of Bache Securities, or Schick, the razor mogul. And these are all examples that Congress, we know about because it was in congressional testimony. They came and testified to Congress and said exactly what they're doing and taunted Congress to do anything about it, and they couldn't. So what they would do is they'd set up a personal holding company. So they would have, say, the Bache Securities Company. He would set up a separate company so that he wouldn't personally get the income, but his company would get the income. And it was set up such that this company was endowed such that the amount of money that it gave off in dividends and interests would equal exactly. He planned it beforehand. He would plan his consumption. Here's the here's the farmhouse I'm going to build. Here are the horses I'm going to buy. Here are the entry fees at Belmont Stakes I'm going to pay for. Here are the golf memberships I'm going to buy. Say $1 million worth of expenditures. He'd endow the thing with $10 million, knowing that he'd get $1 million in income, and then he would deduct all his expenses from that income. And so his income would be zero. So you see the reported income of the rich just plunged in the 30s. And Pickens says, see, we had high taxes and the income inequality really improved. Wow, income inequality really improved. Jules Bache is making as much money as he wants to. He's making, millions. He's not reporting anything because he doesn't have to. Because he's way smarter. It's one thing Jeannie said. Okay, so we're the ones who are the billionaires. Okay, yeah. And government's smarter than us. About money? That's a contradiction in terms. So we know who the smartest people are with their money. It's the top 1% by definition. So you're always the government will always be playing catch up. I mean, it's always chasing a tail. And that's something that the Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, said in 1936. We have a long passage from him. This is FDR's Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau. He said, okay, we have Revenue Bureau, the thing that became known as the IRS in the future. And what we find is that every year, the top 5 or 10% of our revenue agents are hired by the tax bar and private accountancy. They identify the 5 or 10% best agents that we have and then employ them in the private sector to do battle against our agents. And they pay 10 times as much as we pay. So each revenue agent, might be making a couple $1,000. Let's say he's making $5,000 in 1936. How's $50,000 sound? He said they pay them identify them, and then they pay 10 times as much, and then they go against our agents. And it's a completely unequal fight. In fact, it's a contradiction in terms. We can never win because our people aren't as good. We know they're not as good. They specifically stole our best people. And he said, I don't know how to solve this problem outside of lowering the tax rate on the top. So this is the Great Depression. Again, when Jules Bache is doing that with his money and, the tax bar is going on, these are all what can be called deadweight losses. These are all removing the power of the top 1% to actually deploy their money in buying capital, and buying factories, employing people, to avoiding taxes. When you have those kind of deadweight losses, you're going to have mass unemployment. So high tax rates on the rich, especially super high tax rates, always the bottom 50% gets killed. And we have all sorts of stories about this. How it's just these waves of mass unemployment, privation across the bottom 50% of income earners whenever the top tax rates are high. Okay, my favorite tax cut of all, as we were writing this book, I think was the tax cut of 1948. So this is kind of an unsung, little-known tax cut. So the United States came out of World War II with the top tax rate at 91%, 94 for a little while there, 1944, 91%. And during the war, people were patriotic. And that's when the Mellons just said, okay, it's the war. And you look at the statistics, and they have the top 4 taxpayers are Andrew Mellon and Richard B. Mellon, all these people. What is his daughter, Paul Mellon. And that during the war, the rich actually submitted, okay, we'll pay taxes. But then after the war, as soon as the war ended, it's time for a tax cut. So what people would do back then is they would avail themselves of the community property doctrine. Now, help me, is Arizona a common law or community property state? Community property, and that doesn't surprise me because it's part of the Spanish Viceroyalty of New Spain. Because community property is a Spanish tradition. It actually comes from Sharia. It's an Islamic tradition, and the common law is English. And in the community property tradition, the income of a husband and wife is considered to be half earned. No matter who earns it, it's community. It's considered to be half earned by the husband and half earned by the wife. So what people would start doing back then is, if they were in community property states like Texas or Arizona, California, they would, if it's high income, if tax rates going up to 91%, they would declare the husband earned half of it and the wife earned half of it and file 2 tax returns. Well, you have to go start at the bottom on each tax return. Well, you've got to start at the 1% rate and the 2% rate and the 3% rate. If you just declare your whole income, it's all, you get through those first rates and then you stack your second half on top of that and you pay the 91%. No, not with community property. The husband earns all the income. Wife stays at home, does other stuff, non-pecuniary. But you get to file 2 tax returns under community property. Federal government went nuts about this. Supreme Court shut them down every time, beginning in the 1920s. Nope, it's clear as day. Community property, you can file 2 tax returns. So the federal government gave up fighting the Supreme Court. And then states noticed this, and they said, well, why don't we switch to community property? Oklahoma made the decision to switch in 1939, a Texas community property state. And from our studies, we're starting to think that the greatest iconography of the Great Depression, the very privation of Oklahoma, the Dust Bowl, may well have had to do with the migration of rich people to Texas in the late 30s to establish community property as opposed to common law. And that just sucked all the capital out of Oklahoma and led to the mass foreclosure and unemployment problem with the Okies. And where'd the Okies go? They went to a community property state, California. So Oklahoma switched. And then right after the war, all the big guys started to switch. Pennsylvania switched. Pennsylvania, there's no greater center of industrial fortunes than Pennsylvania. It's, English colony. What's it doing switching the English common law? And Michigan switched. Michigan, again, this icon of the Industrial Revolution. And New York was talking about switching. And when New York talked about switching, Congress just said, okay, we've lost 1 million times at the Supreme Court. We will just write it into the federal statute that the equivalent of the two spouses, filing 2 tax returns is in law. And that's where we get the married filing jointly. So married filing jointly is an attempt to replicate if you were a community property state. So both people are filing a tax return, they both start at the bottom. They divide the income in half, and they start with, get the personal exemption, each of them, and then each of them gets to go up the rate. That's the tax cut of 1948. And it happened, it was kind of a federalism thing. The states just told the federal government, if you're not going to do this, we're going to do it. And there's nothing you're going to do to stop us. And the federal government said, no, don't do that, don't do that, don't do that. And the states said, you either do it or we're doing it, no choice. Truman vetoed the bill 3 times. It was overridden. 2/3, and it was April Fool's Day, 1948. And, that tax cut delivered Truman the 1948 election. That whole Dewey defeats Truman stuff. Yeah, the Congress overrode his veto the 3rd time, and there was this major tax cut. The United States went crazy. Yay, economic activity. And, that buoyed the incumbent into the Dewey defeats Truman election in November. And then that was, so. Okay, a little bit on the 1950s. Then I'll just have some words on the Rust Belt. 1950s, the 1950s are something else. So the Korean War happened. So the community property reduced, the tax code of 1948 reduced average tax liabilities at the top. So the top 1%, their average tax liabilities went down by 30% because of the tax cut of 1948. That's really what started post-war prosperity. Oh yeah, by the way, that word shrinkflation that Joe Biden keeps saying? He keeps saying, the president, he keeps saying they call it shrinkflation when packages are bigger and the amount is small. Do you know what I'm talking about? He keeps using this word shrinkflation. I coined that term. And he says, when they call it, what are you calling they? When I wrote about the 1948 tax cut in my book, Iconoclast, in 2009, as Merriam-Webster's dictionary is pleased to testify to. I was speaking of it in macroeconomic terms, not microeconomic terms. So like in the 70s, when you have an expanding price level but a shrinking real output. Pippa Malmgren, it was the first to coin it in microeconomic terms like the president uses. Okay, 1950s. So Korean War happens, Eisenhower is president, and the top tax rate's 92%, and it's cut to 91%, 1954. 91% top tax rate. Where does this leave our rich people? I mean, if you want a history of tax sheltering, look at the American economy in the 1950s. Is there any wonder why there was a single breadwinner in the United States in the 1950s? Okay. The feminine mystique, the women are just packed off to these little 4 walls in the suburbs and don't work. Well, yeah, if you work, you get your income, you got to run it up that income tax code to 91%. So the ratio of employment to population just collapses in the 50s. It gets like 37% or something really low. And your whole life was dictated by tax sheltering. So there was a big book, bestseller, written in the late 50s about how the haves and the have-nots, and even among the working class. So you either figure out how to eat tax shelter or you're behind your neighbor. So for example, you want to eat at the corporate cafeteria. And this is the golden era of the corporate campus, the corporate lab, so there are all these things that are built, with the grand architectural, Skidmore, Owings, Merrill would design laboratories for firms with all these neat designs and artwork and levels of cafeteria. Chrysler Corporation apparently had 9 different cafeterias based on rank. Now what this is that corporations, the corporate income tax rate, by the way, at that point was 52%. You get to deduct all corporate expenses from a 52% rate. So all those expenses, the government is picking up half, a little more than half, because that's deducted from your top line. Okay, we made $10 million last year, minus our cafeteria, which is $1 million. Okay, we only have $9 million in tax liability at 52%. If we had $10 million, we'd have to pay another $520,000. So we spent $1 million, and the government paid $520,000 of that. So our workers don't want to get paid in cash inordinately because it's a progressive income tax system. So if we start laying dollar bills on them, they're going to have to pay at 20, 30, 40, 50% because you go up the tax rate. They want in-kind compensation. They want the cafeterias. They want the experience of the office. They want the experience of chic art. They want the skyscrapers. This is Mad Men and all that stuff. I mean, you know, they have the fancy offices. You spend all day at the office, and that's a kind of an in-kind compensation. And so the corporation gets to deduct. So the expense accounts, they call the expense accounts the swindle sheets. New York City, for example, estimated that essentially all of the hotel rooms and Broadway tickets that were sold in 1959, for example, essentially all were deducted for income tax purposes. So, you know, it's a 52% tax rate. So where's that show up in reported income? Now, that's the top line. That's corporate revenue. That's not corporate profits. So the top 1% doesn't see that as reported income. When you go out to a fancy, the Le Cirque, when you go out to Delmonico's in New York and the corporation picks up the tab because you're a 1% executive, who represents that as income on the tax return? The waiter gets to represent that as income on this tax return. So what you had in the 50s is you had top 1% income morphing as bottom 99% income. You had the actual income of the rich eating at Delmonico's, not reported for income tax purposes, but wherever that money went, like the people you paid to serve your food, they had to report that to income taxes. So in the 50s, you have this bizarre reversal where you have top 1% consumption, utter consumption, you know, the fancy offices, the artwork and all that stuff, represented to the income for the income tax purposes as bottom 50% income. Same thing happened in the Great Depression. So when Piketty said it was a golden era of income inequality, no, it was the worst era of income inequality because the poor were paying were representing the income of the rich before the income tax. The Kennedy cut tax rates. I mean, he understood all this, and that's the big reason that John F. Kennedy said, "Look, it's just got to cut this down." Okay, I just want to have a few remarks about the Rust Belt, and then maybe we can have some questions and answers. State-level income taxation only began in 1912. Hawaii had it before when it was territory. In Wisconsin, Robert La Follette, the great progressive reformer, started the income tax in Wisconsin. And then a few other states, I think 12, picked up an income tax by 1929, Massachusetts, New York. A couple of states in the South, Georgia. Scott Walker, I'm pretty good friends with Scott Walker, former governor of Wisconsin. We do a lot of stuff with him at the Laffer Center, and we were dishing about the Wisconsin income tax a couple of weeks ago, and Governor Walker, and he said, yes, and as you may know, when I was inaugurated, I broke the century-long tradition in 2012, whenever it was. I think it was 2012. The century-long tradition of new governors would swear on Robert La Follette's Bible, and I refused to because he started the income tax in Wisconsin. Okay. Yeah, so there were only a handful of states. And then in the 30s, just a slew of states, I think 22, California, a bunch of states adopted an income tax. Arizona, I believe. Arizona now has perhaps the lowest income tax in the country. What's the top rate is 2.5%, is that right? You are inhaling this under Fife Symington. I mean, he had a plan to do it. He was really phasing it out in the late 90s. And no state has ever repealed its income tax, okay? There are a few examples that are utterly exceptional just because of constitutional vicissitudes in the 30s, when states would impose an income tax and then have to repeal it. So just setting all that aside, no state has ever repealed its income tax, and setting Alaska aside because it used the petroleum. So, and that's, if you want to know why everyone's coming to Arizona. There are 11 states without an income tax, 0, okay? Texas, Florida, Tennessee, where I'm from. It's the reason I'm in Tennessee, of course it is. It's where the reason Laffer is. So you guys are, right there. You're next in line, and you better move because Utah's probably going to do it. Ohio's not. Ohio keeps bragging, we're going to get rid of our income tax. No, they're not. So a bunch of states did it in the 30s. And they did so to offset the horrendous increase in property taxes, which is a story for another day, as we're working on at the Laffer Center right now. But I want to talk about the 11 states that did it from 1961 to 1991. The bulk of them, 10 of them, from 15 years after 1961. And I might as well be telling you the Rust Belt. Okay, so just going to think of a belt. Someone's wearing a belt across the country. New Jersey, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Nebraska. Now I know what you're thinking. You're just listing countries like they're states like they're a belt from West Virginia across to Nebraska. Yeah, it is a belt. Yeah, every one of those states were the 10 who adopted an income tax from 1961 to 1976. There was also Rhode Island and Maine. Now, New Jersey in 1963 adopted its income tax in 1976. It had neither a sales tax nor an income tax. It was the lowest tax state in the country. That's right, New Jersey. I know, your head just exploded. New Jersey was the lowest tax state in the country. In the lifetimes of many of us here in this. Yeah, because now it's the highest tax state in the country. And what is the kind of aspirational status of the nation vis-a-vis New Jersey right now? Is it like, I will beat down doors to get to New Jersey and plant down? That was the state in this country in 1960. That was absolutely the state of this country in 1960. It was absolutely. You look at the population increase, the internal domestic migration to New Jersey was crazy in the 50s. It was Shangri-La. You tell that to California. And the only reason California is Shangri-La is because it has the single greatest state tax reform in American history, which is Proposition 13. I don't even know what's in second place. So every one of these states, they were spooked by the baby boom, and they're like, we have so many children, we have to throw up schools and then public universities, and that costs money, and we can't keep raising property taxes to pay for it, so we're going to pay an income tax. Now, New Jersey did have the highest property taxes outside of Massachusetts in 1963. It did. And it said, we're going to solve that problem by having a sales and income tax. It imposed a sales tax in 1966 and an income tax in 1976 because it had the highest property taxes in 1963. Who has the highest property taxes in the country today? New Jersey, with its income and sales tax. Its income tax is, 9%? Its corporate income tax is 11%. So I've been studying the corporations. I look at their reports and their business decisions. How many corporations decided to move to these places before these new taxes? And then once they came, it's just like, they just completely line item investment from those places. Because whatever you say about the incidence of income taxation, if you're a big employer, who pays the income tax, like the personal income tax? Your employees, which means you have to pay your employees enough so that they will accept a job with you because of the income tax. The company pays the income tax. The incidence is on the employer. It's on the top 1%. And so employers are like, wait a minute, there's now a 5% income tax here, Indiana, Michigan, wherever, Illinois. Oh, that means we have to pay our workers 5% more. Actually, more than that, because if you pay them more, there's a federal income tax progressive structure, and their raise will get into the teeth of the federal income tax, and so you actually have to pay them 5% plus to deal with the 5% state income tax. Oh, so our labor costs are going up 6%. That's our entire profit margin. When the grocery business, what is it? 1% is a profit margin. So you just see it takes about 15 years. The entire story of the development of the Rust Belt is just getting away from states that imposed income taxes in particular from 1961 on.